For 5 straight days, the giant mare refused every morsel of food, her ribs growing visible beneath her coat, as she stood guard over 2 dying foals that weren't even her own. By the time Margaret understood what Bella was really waiting for, she collapsed to the barn floor in tears. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun filtered through the weathered wooden slats of the old barn, casting golden streaks across the hay-covered floor where 2 small figures lay motionless. The air was thick with the scent of fresh straw, and something else. Something that made the heart of anyone who entered that barn sink with worry. This is the story of a giant mare named Bella, and the extraordinary sacrifice she made that would leave an entire community in tears. Bella was no ordinary horse. Standing at 17 hands high, she was the largest mare anyone in the small farming community of Millbrook had ever seen. Her chestnut coat gleamed like burnished copper in the sunlight, and her dark eyes held a wisdom that seemed almost human. For 12 years, she had been the pride of the Henderson farm, a gentle giant who had become something of a local legend. Children from neighboring farms would come just to see her, to touch her soft muzzle and feel the warmth of her breath against their small hands. But what truly set Bella apart was not her size or her beauty. It was her heart. Margaret Henderson, a widow of 63 years, had raised Bella from a foal. Her late husband, Thomas, had brought the young horse home one rainy evening, claiming he had found her abandoned near the old mill road. From that moment, Bella had been more than a farm animal to Margaret. She was family. The two had weathered storms together, literal and figurative, and through the lonely years following Thomas's passing, Bella had been Margaret's constant companion, her reason to get up each morning. 3 months before this story begins, something unexpected happened. A neighboring farm had fallen into financial ruin, and the owners had been forced to abandon their property, leaving behind 2 newborn foals whose mother had died during childbirth. The foals, barely a week old and desperately weak, were discovered by a local farmhand who immediately thought of Margaret and her gentle mare. When he brought them to the Henderson farm, no one could have predicted what would happen next. Bella, who had never had foals of her own, took one look at those trembling, motherless creatures, and something shifted in her eyes. Without hesitation, she approached them, lowering her massive head to nuzzle their fragile bodies. From that moment, she claimed them as her own. The foals, whom Margaret named Hope and Grace, seemed to understand immediately that this giant mare was their protector, their mother in every way that mattered. They would curl up beneath her massive frame, finding warmth and safety in her shadow. For weeks, the arrangement seemed like a miracle. Bella watched over Hope and Grace with fierce devotion, never straying more than a few feet from their side. She would position herself between them and any perceived threat, whether it was the barn cat wandering too close or the occasional visitor who came to marvel at the unlikely family. Margaret watched this transformation with tears in her eyes, amazed at the depth of love an animal could show for creatures that were not even her own flesh and blood. But then, tragedy struck. It began with Grace, the smaller of the 2 foals. Margaret noticed one morning that she was not nursing properly, her little body trembling more than usual. By evening, Hope had begun showing the same symptoms. The veterinarian, Dr. Samuel Webb, arrived within the hour, his face growing increasingly grave as he examined the foals. His diagnosis was devastating. Both foals had contracted a severe respiratory infection, likely from exposure during their first days of life before being rescued. The illness had been dormant, waiting, and now it had emerged with a vengeance. Dr. Webb did not sugarcoat the situation. The Foals were critically ill. They needed round-the-clock care, medication, and most importantly, rest. The next 72 hours would be critical. If they survived that window, there was hope. If not, Margaret should prepare herself for the worst. As the veterinarian packed his equipment, he noticed something that made him pause. Bella was standing over the foals, her massive body positioned like a living shield, and she had not touched the hay that Margaret had placed in her feeding trough that morning. The first day of Bella's vigil began. Margaret brought fresh hay, the finest quality she could find, and placed it directly in front of the mare. Bella did not even acknowledge it. Her eyes remained fixed on Hope and Grace, who lay huddled together on a bed of soft straw, their breathing shallow and labored. Margaret tried everything. She brought apples, Bella's favorite treat. She brought oats mixed with molasses. She even tried hand-feeding the mare, holding the food directly beneath her muzzle. Bella refused it all. By the second day, Margaret's concern had doubled. Not only were the foals fighting for their lives, but now their protector was weakening herself through self-imposed starvation. Dr. Webb returned to check on Hope and Grace and was alarmed to learn that Bella had not eaten in over 36 hours. He examined the mare and found her in good health, aside from the obvious lack of nutrition. There was no physical reason for her refusal to eat. The reason, he realized, was entirely emotional. Bella would not eat because she would not leave her foals. Every moment spent eating was a moment she was not watching over them, not protecting them from whatever invisible enemy was making them sick. In her mind, her own survival was secondary to theirs. Dr. Webb had seen many things in his 30 years as a veterinarian, but he had never witnessed anything quite like this. He warned Margaret that if this continued, Bella herself could become seriously ill. A horse of her size needed significant daily nutrition to maintain her health. 5 days without food could cause irreversible damage. Margaret spent that night in the barn, sitting on an old wooden stool, watching Bella watch the foals. The mare never lay down, never closed her eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. She stood guard like a soldier, her massive frame casting a protective shadow over the two small creatures who had become her entire world. And as Margaret watched, she began to understand something profound about love, about sacrifice, about the bonds that form between living beings regardless of blood or species. The third day dawned gray and cold, a fitting reflection of the mood that had settled over the Henderson farm. Margaret had barely slept, her aging bones aching from the uncomfortable position she had maintained on that wooden stool throughout the night. But her discomfort was nothing compared to the anguish she felt as she watched Bella standing in the exact same position she had been in 12 hours earlier. The mare's legs must have been screaming with fatigue, yet she refused to lie down, refused to rest, refused to do anything that might compromise her vigilance over Hope and Grace. The foals themselves showed little change. Their breathing remained labored, their small bodies still racked with fever. Dr. Webb had left medication and instructions, and Margaret administered the treatments with trembling hands, praying that each dose would be the one that turned the tide. But as she worked, she could not help but notice how Bella watched her every movement, those intelligent eyes tracking each gesture as if ensuring that Margaret was doing everything correctly. It was unnerving and heartbreaking in equal measure. Word of the situation had begun to spread through Millbrook. In small communities like this one, news traveled fast, especially news of the unusual variety. By mid-morning of the third day, neighbors had begun arriving at the Henderson farm, drawn by curiosity and genuine concern. Old Samuel from the general store came with bags of premium feed, hoping that perhaps a different type of food might tempt Bella to eat. Mary Chen from the flower shop brought herbal supplements that she swore had healing properties for both horses and humans alike. Even young Tommy Williams, barely 10 years old, arrived on his bicycle with a handful of carrots from his mother's garden, his eyes wide with worry as he held them out toward the giant mare. Bella acknowledged none of them. She stood like a statue carved from living flesh, her attention never wavering from the two small forms at her feet. When visitors approached the foals, she would shift her position slightly, placing herself between them and the newcomers, but she never showed aggression. Her message was clear without the need for hostility. These were her babies, and she would protect them until her last breath. Margaret tried once again to feed Bella that afternoon. She had prepared a special mash, soft and warm, the kind of comfort food that the mare had always loved during cold winter evenings. She held the bucket beneath Bella's nose, letting the aroma waft upward, hoping to trigger some instinctive response. For a moment, just a moment, Bella's nostrils flared. Her eyes flickered toward the bucket. But then Grace let out a small, pitiful cough, and instantly Bella's attention snapped back to the foals. The bucket might as well have been invisible. That night, Margaret called her daughter Susan, who lived 3 hours away in the city. Through tears, she described what was happening: the sick foals, the starving mare, the helplessness she felt in the face of such devoted love. Susan listened in silence, and when her mother finished speaking, she said she would be there by morning. Margaret protested weakly, saying there was no need, but Susan had already hung up the phone. Some things were more important than the daily routines of city life, and this was one of them. The fourth day brought a small glimmer of hope amid the darkness. When Margaret entered the barn at dawn, she noticed that Hope, the larger of the two foals, was holding her head slightly higher than before. Her eyes seemed clearer, more alert. Dr. Webb arrived for his daily check and confirmed what Margaret had observed. Hope was responding to the medication. Her fever had dropped by 2 degrees, and her breathing, while still labored, had improved noticeably. Grace, however, remained in critical condition. The smaller foal had always been weaker, and the infection had hit her harder. Bella seemed to sense the change in Hope's condition. For the first time in days, Margaret saw something other than to grim determination in the mare's eyes. There was a flicker of something that might have been hope, a tiny spark of light in the darkness. But still, she would not eat. Margaret placed fresh hay directly in her path, positioned so that Bella could reach it without moving from her post. The mare ignored it completely. Her vigil was not over, and until both foals were safe, she would not allow herself the luxury of self-preservation. Susan arrived just before noon, her sedan kicking up dust as she pulled into the farm's gravel driveway. She had not been home in nearly 6 months, the demands of her career as a hospital administrator keeping her tied to the city. But as she stepped out of the car and saw her mother standing in the barn doorway, looking older and more fragile than she remembered, Susan felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She should have visited more often. She should have been here. Mother and daughter embraced without words, holding each other in the way that only family can. Then Susan turned her attention to the scene inside the barn, and her breath caught in her throat. She had heard her mother's description over the phone, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of what she was witnessing. Bella stood like a colossus over the 2 tiny foals, her body thin from days without food, her legs surely aching from standing for so long, yet her eyes burned with a fierce, unwavering love that was almost painful to behold. Susan had always been the practical one in the family, the one who approached problems with logic and reason rather than emotion. But standing in that barn, watching that giant mare sacrifice her own well-being for 2 creatures that were not even her own offspring, Susan felt something shift inside her. She understood, perhaps for the first time, why her mother had chosen this life on the farm, why she had refused to move to the city after her father's death. There was something here that could not be found in boardrooms and hospitals, something raw and real and profoundly beautiful. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Susan sat with her mother in the barn, both women keeping vigil alongside Bella. They did not speak much, but their presence seemed to offer the mare some small comfort. And as darkness fell over the Henderson farm, all anyone could do was wait and hope that tomorrow would bring better news. The fifth day arrived with a silence that seemed to press down upon the Henderson farm like a physical weight. Margaret woke before dawn, her body stiff from another night spent in the barn, and immediately looked toward Bella. The mare had not moved. Her legs trembled slightly now, a visible sign of the toll that days of standing without rest or nourishment had taken on her massive frame. Her coat, once gleaming like polished copper, had grown dull. Her ribs were beginning to show through her sides, yet her eyes remained fixed on hope and grace, as fierce and determined as ever. Dr. Webb arrived earlier than usual that morning, his expression grave as he examined Bella before even looking at the foals. He ran his hands along her sides, felt the prominence of bones that should have been cushioned by healthy flesh, and shook his head slowly. "Margaret," he said quietly, pulling her aside so that Susan could not hear, "we need to talk about this mare. She cannot continue like this. 5 days without food is dangerous for any horse, but for one her size, it could be fatal. Her body is beginning to consume itself for energy. If she does not eat today, we may be looking at permanent damage to her organs." Margaret felt her heart clench at his words. She had known this, of course. She was not naive about the realities of animal husbandry. But hearing it spoken aloud, in the clinical terms of veterinary medicine, made it terrifyingly real. "What do you suggest?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have tried everything. She will not eat. She will not even drink water unless I hold the bucket directly beneath her mouth while she watches the foals." Dr. Webb was silent for a long moment. In his 30 years of practice, he had encountered countless difficult situations. He had saved animals that everyone had given up on, and he had lost animals despite doing everything in his power to save them. But he had never faced a situation quite like this one, where the very love that made Bella so remarkable was also the thing that threatened to destroy her. "There is one option," he said finally, "though I do not recommend it lightly. We could sedate her, force her to rest, and eat. But given her current state of weakness, sedation carries significant risks. And even if it worked, the moment she woke, she would return to this same behavior." Margaret shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "I will not force her. Whatever happens, it has to be her choice. Bella has earned that much respect." The veterinarian nodded, understanding even as he disagreed with the decision from a purely medical standpoint. He turned his attention to the foals, and as he examined them, his expression gradually shifted. Hope was continuing to improve. The larger foal was now able to stand on her own, albeit shakily, and her appetite had returned. She nursed weakly but persistently, her small body fighting to reclaim the strength that illness had stolen. Grace, however, remained a concern. The smaller foal had stabilized, but shown no real improvement. She lay on her bed of straw, her breathing shallow, her eyes half closed. Susan had been watching from the corner of the barn, her arms crossed over her chest. She had taken the week off from work, much to the dismay of her colleagues, and had spent most of her time observing the situation with the analytical eye of someone accustomed to crisis management. That morning, She approached Bella slowly, speaking in soft tones. "Hey there, big girl," she murmured, reaching out to touch the mare's neck. Bella allowed the contact, but did not acknowledge it beyond a slight twitch of her ear. "You know you have to eat, right? Those babies need you healthy. How are you going to take care of them if you collapse?" Bella's only response was to lower her head slightly, her muzzle brushing against Grace's small body in a gesture of infinite tenderness. Susan felt tears prick at her eyes, an unusual sensation for someone who prided herself on emotional control. She stepped back, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and went to join her mother outside the barn. Throughout the day, visitors continued to arrive. News of Bella's vigil had spread far beyond Millbrook now. A reporter from the county newspaper had called, asking for an interview. Margaret had declined, feeling that the story was too personal, too sacred, to be reduced to headlines and photographs. But she could not stop people from coming to the farm, from standing at the barn door and witnessing the scene for themselves. Most left in tears, some left food or donations, unsolicited gestures of support from strangers who had been moved by what they had seen or heard. Late that afternoon, something happened that no one had expected. Young Tommy Williams returned to the farm, this time accompanied by his grandfather, a man named Robert, who had been a horse trainer in his younger days. Robert was well into his 80s now, his body bent by age and arthritis, but his mind remained sharp. He had heard about Bella from his grandson and had insisted on seeing her for himself. When he entered the barn and laid eyes on the giant mare standing guard over her adopted foals, he stopped in his tracks and drew a sharp breath. Margaret watched the old man approach Bella, moving with a slowness that seemed to put the mare at ease. Robert did not try to offer food or make demands. He simply stood beside her, one weathered hand resting gently on her shoulder, and began to speak in a voice so soft that Margaret could barely hear the words. He spoke of horses he had known, of the bonds they formed, of the sacrifices they made. He spoke of a mare he had owned 50 years ago, who had done something similar, standing guard over an injured foal for 3 days straight until help arrived. And then he said something that made Margaret's blood run cold. "That mare," Robert whispered, looking directly into Bella's eyes. She knew something we did not. She could sense that the foal was going to survive. Horses have instincts we cannot understand, connections to life and death that go beyond our comprehension. This one knows something too. She is not just protecting those foals. She is waiting for something. Robert's words hung in the air like a prophecy, leaving everyone in the barn unsettled and strangely hopeful at the same time. Margaret spent that evening turning them over in her mind, trying to understand what the old man had meant. Waiting for something. What could Bella possibly be waiting for? The mare stood in her usual position, her eyes still fixed on the foals, but now Margaret looked at her differently. There was indeed something in Bella's gaze that went beyond simple protective instinct, something deeper and more mysterious than Margaret had initially recognized. The night of the 5th day was the longest Margaret had ever experienced. She refused to leave the barn, despite Susan's pleas that she needed proper rest. Her daughter had set up a cot near the barn door, insisting that if her mother was going to maintain this vigil, she would at least do so with some degree of comfort. Margaret accepted the arrangement but slept fitfully, waking every hour to check on Bella and the foals. Each time she opened her eyes, the scene was the same. Bella standing, watching, waiting. Hope showing slow but steady improvement. Grace still hovering in that terrible space between life and death. Sometime around 3 in the morning, Margaret woke to a sound she did not immediately recognize. It was soft, almost imperceptible, a kind of rustling accompanied by a gentle nicker. She sat up on the cot, her old bones protesting the sudden movement, and peered into the dimness of the barn. What she saw made her heart stop for a moment before it began racing with a mixture of fear and wonder. Bella had finally moved. For the first time in 5 days, the giant mare had shifted from her position. But she had not moved to eat or drink or rest. Instead, she had lowered herself to the ground, something that horses her size rarely did, and that exhausted horses often could not do without risking injury. Bella lay beside Grace, her massive body curved around the small foal like a living fortress. Her head was bent, her muzzle pressed against Grace's side, and she was making that soft, nickering sound that Margaret had heard, a sound of comfort and encouragement. Margaret approached slowly, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening. As she drew closer, she noticed that Grace's eyes were open, looking up at Bella with an expression that could only be described as awareness. The foal, who had been barely conscious for days, was awake and alert. Her breathing, though still labored, seemed somehow stronger. And there, in the darkness of that barn in the small hours of the morning, something passed between the mare and the foal that Margaret could not name or explain. Susan found them like that when she came to check on her mother an hour later. She stood in the doorway, frozen by the scene before her. The practical, logical part of her brain tried to rationalize what she was seeing, to explain it in terms of animal behavior and coincidence. But there was another part of her, a part she had long suppressed beneath the demands of her professional life, that recognized the moment for what it was. This was not science. This was something far older and more powerful. The 6th day dawned with a transformation that no one had dared to hope for. Grace, the smaller foal who had been fighting for her life, lifted her head on her own. She made a small sound, a weak but unmistakable call for food. Dr. Webb, who arrived early as had become his habit, examined her with barely concealed astonishment. Her fever had broken during the night. Her lungs, while still congested, were clearing. Against all medical expectations, Grace had turned the corner. But it was what happened next that would become the defining moment of this story, the moment that would be retold in Millbrook for generations to come. As Dr. Webb completed his examination and confirmed that both foals were on the road to recovery, Bella slowly raised herself from the ground. Her legs shook with the effort. Her body was weak from days without food. But she stood, and she turned her great head toward Margaret. And in her eyes was something that looked remarkably like relief. Margaret understood immediately. She grabbed the bucket of oat mash that Susan had prepared that morning, more out of habit than hope, and held it toward Bella. The mare hesitated for just a moment, her gaze dropping to the foals one last time as if confirming that they were truly going to be all right. Then, with a gentleness that belied her size and her hunger, Bella lowered her muzzle into the bucket and began to eat. The sound of Bella eating, something that would have been completely unremarkable under normal circumstances, brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. Margaret wept openly. Susan, who had not cried since her father's funeral, found herself sobbing without restraint. Even Dr. Webb, a man who had built his career on professional detachment, had to turn away to compose himself. After 5 days of refusing all sustenance, Bella had finally allowed herself to be nourished, because her foals were safe. Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By noon, the farm was crowded with visitors, all wanting to see the mare who had starved herself for nearly a week to protect 2 orphaned foals. They brought food and flowers and cards expressing admiration for Bella and gratitude to Margaret for sharing this story with the community. The county reporter who had called earlier returned in person, and this time Margaret agreed to speak with her. Some stories, she realized, were meant to be told. Some examples of love and sacrifice deserve to be shared with the world. Throughout the commotion, Bella remained calm. She ate slowly, her system unable to handle large amounts of food after such a prolonged fast. Dr. Webb supervised her feeding carefully, providing small meals at regular intervals to prevent any digestive complications. The mare accepted the food without complaint, but her attention never strayed far from hope and grace. Even now, with the crisis past, her devotion to them was absolute. As the sun set on the 6th day, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Margaret sat beside Bella in the barn. The foals were sleeping peacefully, their breathing even and untroubled for the first time in nearly a week. Margaret reached out and stroked Bella's neck, feeling the bones beneath the skin, evidence of the sacrifice the mare had made. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. "You knew they would survive. You were just waiting for them to be ready." Bella turned her head and regarded Margaret with those wise, ancient eyes, and though she could not speak, her silence said everything. The days that followed Bella's return to eating were filled with a quiet kind of joy that permeated every corner of the Henderson farm. Margaret found herself waking each morning with a lightness in her chest that she had not felt in years, a sense of gratitude so profound that it brought tears to her eyes before she even left her bed. The crisis had passed, but its echoes remained, reminding everyone who had witnessed it of the extraordinary love that existed within that old wooden barn. Hope and grace continued to improve with each passing day. The larger foal, Hope, was the first to regain her full strength. Within a week of the turning point, she was trotting around the barn on wobbly but determined legs, exploring her surroundings with the curiosity that defines all young creatures. She would venture a few feet from Bella, then look back as if seeking permission before continuing her explorations. The mare watched her with patient indulgence, allowing the foal her independence while remaining ever vigilant. Grace's recovery was slower but no less miraculous. The smaller foal had been closer to death than anyone had realized, and her body needed more time to heal. But heal she did, gradually regaining her appetite, her energy, and her playful spirit. Dr. Webb, who continued to visit regularly despite the immediate danger having passed, marveled at her progress during each examination. By all medical standards, he told Margaret one afternoon, this foal should not have survived. Whatever happened in this barn that night, it was not something I can explain with veterinary science. Margaret smiled at his words, but said nothing. She had stopped trying to explain what had happened. Some things were beyond the reach of logic and reason, belonging instead to that mysterious realm where love and instinct and faith intertwined in ways that human understanding could not fully grasp. Bella had known something that none of them had known. She had seen something in those foals, some spark of life that her vigilance had helped to protect and nurture. That was enough for Margaret. She needed no further explanation. As Bella regained her strength, the bond between her and the foals deepened in ways that touched everyone who observed them. The mare, who had never given birth herself, had become a mother in every meaningful sense of the word. She groomed the foals with meticulous care, her rough tongue smoothing their coats until they shone. She positioned herself between them and any perceived threat, her massive body a living shield against the dangers of the world. And at night, when the barn grew quiet and the stars appeared in the darkening sky, she would stand watch over them as they slept, her eyes soft with a tenderness that seemed almost human. Susan stayed at the farm for 2 weeks before the demands of her job finally pulled her back to the city. But those 2 weeks changed her in ways she had not anticipated. Living alongside her mother, witnessing Bella's devotion to the foals, and participating in the daily rhythms of farm life had awakened something within her that she had long forgotten. On her last evening at the farm, she sat with Margaret on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon. "Mom," she said quietly, "I have been thinking about some things, about my life, about what matters. These past 2 weeks have shown me something I had lost sight of." Margaret looked at her daughter, waiting. Susan continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I have spent so many years chasing success, climbing the corporate ladder, measuring my worth in titles and salaries. But watching Bella with those foals, seeing the kind of love that asks for nothing in return, it made me realize how empty my life has become. I have no one who would sacrifice for me the way that Mare sacrificed for hope and grace. And I have no one I would sacrifice for either." Margaret reached over and took her daughter's hand. "It is never too late to change," she said gently. "Life has a way of offering us second chances when we are ready to receive them. Just look at those foals. They were abandoned, left for dead, and now they have a mother who loves them more than her own life. If that is not a second chance, I do not know what is." Susan nodded, tears streaming down her face. She did not have all the answers, not yet, but she knew that something had shifted inside her, a tectonic movement in the landscape of her soul that would eventually lead her to a different kind of life. For now, it was enough to sit here with her mother, watching the stars emerge one by one, feeling connected to something larger than herself. The story of Bella and her foals continued to spread in the weeks that followed. The county newspaper published a feature article that was picked up by regional outlets, then national ones. Photographers came to the farm, capturing images of the giant mare standing protectively over hope and grace. A local television station sent a crew to film a segment for their evening news program. Margaret, who had always valued her privacy, found herself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. At first, she was uncomfortable with the attention. She had not sought fame or recognition. She had simply done what any compassionate person would do, taking in 2 orphaned foals and allowing her mare to care for them. But as she read the letters and emails that began pouring in from across the country, she realized that Bella's story was touching people in ways she had never imagined. A woman in Ohio wrote to say that the story had inspired her to adopt a rescue horse. A man in Texas shared that he had reconciled with his estranged son after reading about Bella's sacrifice. A teenage girl in California said the story had given her hope during a difficult time in her life. Margaret began to understand that Bella's story was not just about a mare and her foals. It was about the universal power of love, the extraordinary things that become possible when we put the needs of others before our own. It was a reminder that in a world often dominated by selfishness and indifference, there were still pure hearts capable of remarkable devotion, and it was a testament to the bonds that form between creatures, bonds that transcend species and circumstance and speak to something fundamental in all living beings. As summer turned to autumn and the leaves began to change, Margaret looked forward to each new day with renewed appreciation. Her farm had become a place of pilgrimage for people seeking inspiration, and though she sometimes missed the quiet solitude of her former life, she knew that sharing Bella's story was important. Some lights were meant to shine for all to see. The autumn months brought a golden transformation to the Henderson farm. The trees that lined the property burst into brilliant shades of orange and red, their leaves drifting lazily to the ground like nature's confetti. Hope and Grace, now fully recovered from their illness, had grown into strong and healthy young horses, their bodies filling out with muscle and vitality. They spent their days exploring the pastures under Bella's watchful eye, racing each other across the fields with the boundless energy of youth. while their adoptive mother grazed nearby, always alert, always protective. Margaret observed this transformation with a heart full of gratitude. She had weathered many seasons on this farm, had experienced both joy and sorrow within its boundaries, but she could not remember a time when she had felt more at peace. The ordeal with the foals had reminded her of what truly mattered in life, stripping away the trivial concerns that so often clouded human vision and leaving behind only the essential truths: love, sacrifice, connection. These were the things that gave life meaning, and they were abundant on her little piece of land. The visitors who had flocked to the farm during the height of Bella's fame gradually decreased in number as autumn progressed. The news cycle moved on to other stories, other sensations, and the world largely forgot about the giant mare who had starved herself to save 2 orphaned foals. But Margaret did not mind the return to quiet. She had never sought attention, and she was relieved to have her privacy restored. The people who truly mattered, those who had been touched deeply by Bella's story, would carry it in their hearts forever. That was enough. One October morning, Margaret received a phone call that would set in motion a new chapter in this ongoing story. The caller was a woman named Elizabeth Hartwell, the director of an organization called Horses of Hope, a nonprofit dedicated to rescuing abused and abandoned horses across the country. Elizabeth had read about Bella in one of the national publications and had been so moved that she felt compelled to reach out personally. "Mrs. Henderson," Elizabeth said, her voice warm and professional, "I want you to know that your mare's story has inspired our entire organization. We have seen an increase in donations and volunteer applications since the article was published. People want to be part of something meaningful, and Bella has shown them what meaningful looks like." Margaret listened, touched by the woman's words but uncertain where the conversation was heading. Elizabeth continued, "I am calling because I would like to propose something. We are planning our annual fundraising gala next month, and I would be honored if you and Bella could be our guests of honor. We want to share her story with an audience that can make a real difference for horses in need." Margaret's initial reaction was to decline. The thought of transporting Bella and the foals to some fancy event filled her with anxiety. She was a simple farm woman, uncomfortable in crowds and unfamiliar with the world of galas and fundraisers. But as Elizabeth explained the impact that Bella's presence could have, the horses that could be saved, the awareness that could be raised, Margaret found her resistance weakening. She thought of Hope and Grace, who had been rescued themselves, who had been given a second chance because someone had cared enough to save them. How could she refuse an opportunity to help other horses receive the same gift? After a long conversation and much deliberation, Margaret agreed to attend the gala, though she made it clear that Bella's well-being would be the top priority. If the mare showed any signs of distress, they would leave immediately. Elizabeth assured her that every accommodation would be made to ensure Bella's comfort. The organization would send a specialized horse trailer, provide a quiet holding area at the venue, and limit Bella's exposure to the crowd. Margaret hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement that she had not experienced in years. The weeks leading up to the gala were filled with preparations. Dr. Webb examined Bella and the foals thoroughly, pronouncing all 3 in excellent health and fit for travel. Margaret purchased a new dress for the occasion, her first new garment in longer than she could remember. Susan took time off work to accompany her mother, refusing to let her face such an unfamiliar situation alone. And Bella, as if sensing the importance of the coming event, seemed to carry herself with an extra measure of dignity, her head held high, her eyes bright with intelligence. The day of the gala arrived crisp and clear, a perfect November evening with a bite of winter in the air. The event was being held at a historic estate just 2 hours from Millbrook, a sprawling property with stables that had once housed championship thoroughbreds. When the specialized trailer pulled up to the Henderson farm that afternoon, Bella loaded without hesitation, as if she understood the importance of the journey. Hope and Grace, though not officially part of the program, had been invited as well, their presence essential to telling the complete story. The drive to the estate was uneventful. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of Susan's car, which followed the horse trailer along winding country roads lined with bare trees. She watched the landscape pass by the window, thinking about how strange it was that life could change so dramatically in such a short time. 6 months ago, she had been a lonely widow tending a quiet farm, her days marked by routine and solitude. Now she was traveling to a gala, where hundreds of people would gather to celebrate her mare's extraordinary act of love. When they arrived at the estate, Margaret was immediately overwhelmed by the scale of the event. Luxury vehicles lined the long driveway. Well-dressed attendees mingled on the manicured grounds. A string quartet played somewhere in the distance. This was a world she did not belong to, a world of wealth and influence that seemed as foreign as another planet. But then she looked toward the stable area where Bella was being unloaded, and she saw the crowd that had already gathered to catch a glimpse of the famous mare. Their faces held none of the polished indifference she had expected. Instead, she saw wonder, admiration, and genuine emotion. These people, regardless of their bank accounts or social standing, had been touched by Bella's story just as Margaret had been. Susan squeezed her mother's hand. "Ready?" she asked. Margaret took a deep breath and nodded. "As ready as I will ever be," she replied, and together they walked toward the gathering crowd. The gala exceeded anything Margaret could have imagined. The main ballroom of the estate had been transformed into an elegant celebration of equine rescue, with photographs of saved horses adorning the walls and centerpieces featuring miniature horse figurines crafted from crystal. Round tables draped in white linens filled the space, each seating 10 guests who had paid generously for the privilege of attending. At the front of the room, a large screen displayed a slideshow of before and after images. Gaunt and neglected horses transformed into healthy, vibrant animals through the work of Horses of Hope. But the true attraction of the evening was not inside the ballroom. It was in the stable area, where Bella stood with Hope and Grace in a beautifully prepared stall that had been decorated with ribbons and flowers. A steady stream of guests made their way to see her throughout the cocktail hour, their expensive shoes clicking on the stone floor as they approached the gentle giant who had captured the nation's heart. Margaret stood nearby, answering questions and sharing details of Bella's story with people who hung on her every word. Elizabeth Hartwell proved to be a gracious and attentive host. She introduced Margaret to board members, major donors, and fellow rescue operators from across the country. Each person expressed profound admiration for what Bella had done, and many shared their own stories of remarkable horses they had known. Margaret began to realize that Bella's story, while exceptional, was part of a larger tapestry of equine devotion that stretched across the world. Horses, it seemed, possessed a capacity for love and sacrifice that humans were only beginning to understand. As the evening progressed and dinner was served, Margaret found herself seated at the head table alongside Elizabeth, the board chairman, and several distinguished guests. She felt profoundly out of place among these polished individuals with their easy confidence and cultured conversation. But Susan sat beside her, providing silent support and occasional whispered encouragement. When the servers brought out plates of elegantly prepared food, Margaret could barely eat. Her stomach was tied in knots at the thought of the speech she had been asked to give. The moment arrived after dessert. Elizabeth took the podium and delivered a passionate address about the mission of Horses of Hope, the thousands of animals they had rescued over the years, and the challenges that still lay ahead. She spoke of the cruelty that horses faced at the hands of negligent owners, the horrors of kill pens and slaughterhouses, and the desperate need for sanctuaries where these noble creatures could live out their days in peace. Her words moved many in the audience to tears, and when she finished, the applause was thunderous. Then Elizabeth turned toward Margaret and extended her hand. "And now," she said, her voice softening with emotion, "I would like to introduce someone very special. A woman whose mare taught us all what love truly means. Please welcome Mrs. Margaret Henderson." Margaret rose on unsteady legs and made her way to the podium. The applause that greeted her was warm and sustained, but she barely heard it over the pounding of her heart. She gripped the edges of the lectern and looked out at the sea of faces before her, these strangers who had gathered to honor her beloved Bella. For a moment, she could not speak. The words she had prepared seemed inadequate, too small to capture the magnitude of what she had witnessed. She took a deep breath and began. "When my husband Thomas brought Bella home 20 years ago, she was just a foal, abandoned and afraid. I did not know then that she would become the greatest teacher I have ever had." Her voice trembled slightly, but she pressed on. "3 months ago, 2 orphaned foals came to our farm. They had lost their mother and were barely clinging to life. Bella, who had never had babies of her own, took them in without hesitation. She became their mother in every way that mattered." Margaret paused, gathering herself. "When those foals fell ill, Bella did something I will never forget. She refused to eat. For 5 days, she stood guard over them, starving herself because she would not leave their side for even a moment. The veterinarian told me that horses of her size need significant daily nutrition. He warned me that what she was doing could kill her. But Bella did not care about her own survival. All she cared about was those 2 little ones who needed her." The ballroom had fallen completely silent. Margaret could see tears glistening on faces throughout the crowd, handkerchiefs being pressed to eyes, hands reaching out to clutch the hands of loved ones. She continued, "On the 5th night, something happened that I cannot explain. Bella lay down beside the sicker foal, something a horse her size rarely does, and she stayed there all night. By morning, both foals had turned the corner. They were going to live, and only then, when she knew they were safe, did Bella allow herself to eat again." Margaret looked down at her notes, then set them aside. "What I learned from Bella is this: love is not a feeling, it is an action. It is a choice we make every day, to put someone else's needs before our own. Bella showed me that love asks for nothing in return. It does not calculate costs or measure benefits. It simply gives, completely and without reservation." She lifted her eyes to the audience. "I am just a simple farm woman from a small town. I do not have money or influence or power, but I have Bella, and she has taught me more about what it means to truly love than all the books and sermons in the world." The applause that followed her speech was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. People rose to their feet, their clapping sustained and genuine, their faces wet with tears. Elizabeth embraced her at the podium, whispering words of thanks in her ear. Susan stood at the edge of the room, openly weeping with pride for her mother. And somewhere in the stable area, Bella stood peacefully with her foals, unaware of the impact her story was having on hundreds of human hearts. That night, Horses of Hope raised more money than they had in any previous gala. Donations poured in during Margaret's speech and continued long after the event ended. But for Margaret, the The true gift of the evening was not financial. It was the knowledge that Bella's love had touched so many lives, spreading outward like ripples on a pond, inspiring countless acts of compassion that she would never see, but that would make the world a little bit better. The return to Millbrook after the gala felt like emerging from a dream. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of Susan's car, watching the familiar landscape reappear as they drew closer to home. And she found herself processing everything that had happened over the past 24 hours. The speeches, the applause, the tearful embraces from strangers who had been moved by Bella's story. It all seemed surreal now, like something that had happened to someone else. But the memory of those hundreds of faces looking up at her as she spoke, their eyes filled with emotion and understanding, that was something she would carry with her forever. Bella and the Foals arrived home safely, the specialized trailer delivering them to the farm just as the sun was setting. When Margaret opened the trailer door and saw her mare standing there, patient and dignified as always, she felt a rush of love so powerful that it nearly brought her to her knees. She pressed her face against Bella's neck and breathed in the familiar scent of horse and hay, grounding herself in the simple reality of this moment. Whatever had happened at the gala, whatever impact their story might have on the wider world, this was what mattered most. This connection, this love. The weeks following the gala brought an unexpected development. Donations continued to pour into Horses of Hope, inspired by Bella's story, and Elizabeth Hartwell called Margaret with a proposal. The organization wanted to establish a satellite sanctuary on the Henderson farm, a small-scale operation that would rescue and rehabilitate horses in need. They would provide funding for improvements to the property, veterinary care for the animals, and a modest salary for Margaret to oversee the operation. In return, the farm would become part of the Horses of Hope network, a place where abandoned and abused horses could find healing. Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. She valued her privacy and her independence, and the thought of her quiet farm becoming an official sanctuary felt overwhelming. But as she walked through the pastures that evening, watching Bella graze peacefully while Hope and Grace played nearby, she began to reconsider. How many horses were out there right now, suffering the way those foals had suffered before being rescued? How many could be saved if she opened her heart and her land to them? Bella had taught her that love was not meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared. After much deliberation and several conversations with Susan, who offered both practical advice and emotional support, Margaret accepted Elizabeth's proposal. The transformation of the Henderson farm began that winter. A new barn was constructed, larger and more modern than the original, with heated stalls and proper medical facilities. Fencing was expanded to create additional pastures. A small office was set up in the farmhouse where Margaret could coordinate rescue operations and communicate with the main organization. By spring, the Henderson Sanctuary, as it came to be called, was ready to receive its first residents. The horses arrived in groups of 2 and 3, each one carrying a story of neglect or abuse that broke Margaret's heart. There was Thunder, a once magnificent stallion who had been starved nearly to death by an owner who could not afford his care. There was Daisy, a gentle mare whose back bore the scars of years of beatings. There was Little Patch, a pony whose hooves had grown so long from neglect that he could barely walk. Each animal arrived broken in body or spirit or both, and each one was welcomed into the sanctuary with the same love and dedication that Margaret had shown to Hope and Grace. Bella, to Margaret's amazement, seemed to understand exactly what was happening. The giant mare took an active role in welcoming each new arrival, approaching them with the same gentle patience she had shown the foals. She would stand beside the frightened newcomers, her calm presence serving as reassurance that they were safe, that the terror of their past was behind them. The other horses responded to her instinctively, drawn to her maternal energy, finding comfort in her massive shadow. She became the heart of the sanctuary, the anchor around which everything else revolved. Hope and Grace, now yearlings, grew into beautiful young horses under Bella's watchful eye. They had been too young to remember their birth mother, too young to understand the precariousness of their early days, but they knew Bella. She was their mother in every way that mattered, and they adored her with a devotion that mirrored her own. Watching the three of them together, moving across the pastures in perfect harmony, Margaret often found herself moved to tears. This was what love looked like. This was what family meant. Susan visited more frequently now, her priorities having shifted after those transformative weeks at the farm. She had begun dating a veterinarian she met through one of Dr. Webb's colleagues, a kind man named Michael, who shared her growing appreciation for rural life. When she announced that she was considering leaving her hospital administrator position to work with the rescue organization full-time, Margaret was not surprised. The seeds planted during Bella's vigil had taken root and were now blossoming into something beautiful. As the first anniversary of the foal's illness approached, Margaret began planning a small celebration. She wanted to mark the occasion not with sadness or solemnity, but with gratitude for everything that had come from that terrible time. Elizabeth Hartwell agreed to visit, as did several other supporters who had become friends over the past year. Dr. Webb promised to attend with his wife. Even old Robert, the former horse trainer who had spoken those prophetic words about Bella waiting for something, confirmed that he would make the journey. But as preparations continued, Margaret noticed something that filled her with a quiet unease. Bella, who had been so vibrant and active since her recovery, seemed to be slowing down. Her movements were stiffer in the mornings. Her appetite, while still healthy, had decreased slightly. And there was something in her eyes, a distance that had not been there before, as if she were looking at something beyond the visible world. Dr. Webb examined her during one of his regular visits and found nothing specifically wrong. "She is getting older," he said gently. "Horses her size do not live as long as smaller breeds. Her body has been through a lot." Margaret nodded, accepting his words even as her heart resisted them. She had known this day would come eventually, but that knowledge did nothing to prepare her for the grief that was already beginning to gather at the edges of her consciousness. The anniversary celebration was held on a crisp November afternoon, exactly 1 year after the night when Bella had laid down beside Grace and somehow willed both foals back to life. The Henderson sanctuary had been decorated with simple but festive touches, ribbons tied to fence posts and a banner stretched across the entrance welcoming visitors. Tables had been set up in the main barn, laden with food prepared by neighbors and supporters who wanted to contribute to the occasion. The atmosphere was one of joy and gratitude, a recognition of how far they had all come since those dark days. Margaret moved through the celebration with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She greeted guests warmly, accepted their congratulations and good wishes, and shared stories about the sanctuary's first year of operation. 15 horses had been rescued and rehabilitated since the farm became an official sanctuary. 3 had been successfully adopted into loving homes. The others remained at Henderson, their permanent home, part of the growing family that Bella had helped to create. It was a remarkable achievement, one that Margaret knew she could never have accomplished alone. But beneath the celebration, a shadow lingered. Bella had been declining steadily over the past few weeks, her condition worsening despite Dr. Webb's best efforts. The mare, who had once stood so tall and proud, now moved slowly, her joints stiff with arthritis, her breathing occasionally labored. She still watched over the other horses, still positioned herself near Hope and Grace whenever they were in the barn, but her energy was diminished. The fire that had burned so brightly in her eyes during her 5-day vigil had faded to a gentle ember. During the celebration, guests took turns visiting Bella in her stall, which had been made especially comfortable with extra bedding and a heat lamp to ease her aching joints. Many of them had tears in their eyes as they stroked her graying muzzle, sensing what Margaret herself had been struggling to accept. Elizabeth Hartwell stood beside the mare for a long time, speaking softly, thanking her for everything she had given to the rescue movement. Old Robert, leaning heavily on his cane, simply placed his weathered hand on her neck and stood in silence, a connection between two old souls who understood things that younger beings could not. Hope and Grace seemed to sense the gravity of the moment as well. The yearlings, now strong and beautiful, stayed close to Bella throughout the day. They nuzzled her gently, their young bodies pressing against hers as if trying to transfer some of their vitality to the mare who had saved their lives. Watching them, Margaret remembered how small and fragile they had been just 1 year ago, how close to death. Bella had given them everything, had poured her own strength into them during those terrible days, and now, it seemed, she was reaching the end of what she had to give. After the guests departed and the farm grew quiet, Margaret sat alone with Bella in the barn. The evening light filtered through the wooden slats, casting long shadows across the hay-covered floor. Susan had offered to stay, but Margaret had asked for this time alone with her mare. There were things she needed to say, words that had been building in her heart for months, perhaps for years. "Bella," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I do not know if you can understand me, but I need you to know something." She paused, wiping tears from her cheeks. "You saved those foals. Everyone knows that. But what they do not know is that you saved me too. After Thomas died, I did not want to go on. I went through the motions of living, but I was not really alive. You brought me back, just like you brought back Hope and Grace. You showed me that there was still love in the world, still reasons to get up each morning." Bella turned her great head toward Margaret, her dark eyes holding a depth of understanding that seemed impossible for an animal. Margaret continued, "Because of you, this farm has become a sanctuary. Because of you, 15 horses have been saved, with more to come. Because of you, my daughter found her way back to what matters in life. Because of you, hundreds of people have been inspired to show kindness to animals who need it. Your love has spread across the world, Bella. It has changed everything." The mare lowered her head, resting it in Margaret's lap. It was a gesture of trust and affection that she had made countless times over the years, but tonight it felt different. It felt like a goodbye. Margaret stroked the soft fur between Bella's ears, memorizing the texture, the warmth, the gentle rhythm of her breathing. The days that followed the celebration brought a rapid decline. Bella stopped eating on a Tuesday, though this time there were no foals to protect, no crisis to justify her refusal. Dr. Webb came and examined her, his face grave as he delivered the news that Margaret had been dreading. Her organs were shutting down, a natural process of aging accelerated by the strain her body had endured over the years. There was no treatment, no intervention that could stop what was happening. All they could do was keep her comfortable and let nature take its course. Margaret did not leave Bella's side. She slept in the barn, wrapped in blankets, rising every few hours to check on the mare, who had been her companion for 2 decades. Susan and Michael came to help, taking shifts so that Margaret could rest. But she refused to sleep for more than an hour at a time. She wanted to be there. She needed to be there. Hope and Grace maintained their vigil as well. The yearlings stood outside Bella's stall, watching through the bars, their eyes filled with an emotion that looked remarkably like grief. They seemed to understand that their mother was leaving them, that the great heart that had beaten so fiercely for their sake was now growing still. When Margaret looked at them, she saw echoes of Bella in their posture, their patience, their unwavering devotion. The legacy would continue through them. On the 5th night of Bella's decline, Margaret noticed something that made her catch her breath. The mare, who had been lying down for most of the day, was attempting to rise. Her legs shook with the effort, her body trembling against the strain. But slowly, impossibly, she stood. Margaret watched in amazement as Bella turned toward Hope and Grace, her eyes meeting theirs through the bars of the stall. And in that moment, a wordless message passed between them, a final gift from mother to daughters. Bella stood there for what felt like an eternity, her legs trembling beneath the weight of her failing body, her eyes locked with those of her daughters. Margaret watched, frozen in place, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed this final act of maternal love. The mare, who had refused to lie down during her 5-day vigil, who had stood guard over her foals with a devotion that defied all reason, was standing one last time, not to protect them now, but to show them that she was still their mother, that even in her final moments, she would face whatever came next with the same dignity and courage that had defined her entire life. Hope nickered softly, pressing her muzzle through the bars of the stall. Grace did the same, both yearlings straining to be closer to the mare who had given them everything. Bella lowered her head, touching each of their faces in turn, breathing in their scent, as if committing it to memory for a journey to someplace beyond this world. The golden light of dawn was beginning to filter through the barn windows, casting a warm glow over the scene, and Margaret could have sworn she saw something pass between the 3 horses, some invisible thread of love that would never be broken, not even by death. Then, slowly and with great care, Bella turned toward Margaret. The mare's eyes, which had grown cloudy with age and illness, seemed to clear for just a moment. In them, Margaret saw everything they had shared over 20 years. The quiet mornings spent grooming her coat, the long rides through the countryside when Thomas was still alive, the countless nights of companionship during the lonely years of widowhood, the miraculous days when Bella had taught her what it truly meant to love without reservation. All of it was there, reflected in those dark and ancient eyes. Margaret stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Bella's neck, pressing her face into the familiar warmth of her coat. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for everything, for the foals, for the sanctuary, for showing me how to live again. I love you, Bella. I will always love you." Bella exhaled slowly, a long and peaceful breath that seemed to carry away all the pain and weariness of her failing body. Her head lowered, resting against Margaret's shoulder, and for a moment they stood together, just as they had stood together so many times before. 2 souls who had found each other in a world that could be cruel and indifferent, who had created something beautiful in the face of that cruelty. And then, with a gentleness that matched her nature, Bella sank to the ground. Margaret went down with her, cradling the mare's great head in her lap, stroking her mane as her breathing grew shallow. Dr. Webb had arrived at some point during the night, and he stood at the edge of the stall, ready to help if needed, but understanding that this moment belonged to Margaret and Bella alone. Susan stood beside him, tears streaming down her face, her hand clutching Michael's. The end came quietly, as peaceful as a sunset fading into night. One moment Bella was breathing, her sides rising and falling in that familiar rhythm. The next moment she was still, her eyes closing as if she were simply going to sleep. Margaret felt the exact instant when her spirit departed, a subtle shift in the energy around them, and she knew that Bella was gone. The grief that followed was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. It was deeper than the grief she had felt when Thomas died, more profound than any loss she had known. Bella had been more than a horse, more than a pet, more than a companion. She had been a teacher, a healer, a living example of unconditional love. Her absence left a hole in Margaret's heart that she knew would never fully heal. But even in the depths of her sorrow, Margaret found comfort in the legacy that Bella had left behind. Hope and grace, the foals whose lives she had saved, stood strong and healthy in the pasture. The sanctuary that had grown from her story continued to rescue horses in need. The hundreds of people who had been inspired by her devotion continued to spread kindness throughout the world. Bella's love had not died with her body. It had multiplied, rippling outward in ways that would continue for generations. The memorial service was held 3 days later, on a hillside overlooking the farm where Bella had spent her entire life. Neighbors and supporters came from across the county to pay their respects. Elizabeth Hartwell delivered a eulogy that left no eye dry. Old Robert stood at the grave site and spoke of the ancient bond between horses and humans, a bond that Bella had embodied more perfectly than any horse he had ever known. Margaret placed a single white flower on the freshly turned earth and spoke her final words to her beloved mare. "You taught me that love is not about what we receive," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. "It is about what we give. You gave everything, Bella, everything, and I promise you that I will spend the rest of my days honoring your memory by giving the same love to every horse who comes to this sanctuary." In the months that followed, the Henderson Sanctuary continued to grow. More horses were rescued, more lives were saved, more hearts were touched by the story of the giant mare who refused to eat for 5 days to protect her sick foals. Hope and grace grew into magnificent horses who carried within them the spirit of their adoptive mother. They were gentle with the new arrivals, patient with the frightened and abused, protective of the vulnerable. Bella's legacy lived on through them, through every horse at the sanctuary, through every person who had been changed by her example. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set behind the hills and the golden light streamed through the barn windows, Margaret would sit in the pasture and watch her horses graze. She would feel a presence beside her, warm and familiar, and she would smile through her tears. Bella was still there, she knew. Love like that never truly dies. It simply changes form, becoming something eternal, something that transcends the boundaries between this world and whatever lies beyond. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like and share it with others who might need to hear it. Leave a comment telling us how Bella's story has inspired you. And if you have not already, subscribe to join our community of animal lovers. Remember, the greatest gift we can give is love without expectation. Bella taught us that. Let us honor her memory by living it every day.